Hello, everyone. Today we're going to discuss the close reading and context essay. This is not going to be the most entertaining video, so I'm wearing this fun shirt to try to liven things up. The first essay you wrote this semester, the close reading essay, focused very intensely on a single short literary text. This essay, the close reading and context essay, builds on that one. In this essay, you'll be exploring the potential relationship between two texts, either between The Time Machine and the conclusion of The Descent of Man, or between The Time Machine and the Communist Manifesto. So how do you do this? How do you explore the potential relationship between two texts, especially when one is literary and the other is scientific or political? The first thing I want to make clear is that the basic essay structure has not changed. The basic structure of the close reading and context essay is the same as the basic structure of the close reading essay, as discussed in a previous video. This essay, like the previous essay, is structured like this, with an introduction that articulates its overall argument in a thesis statement, and body paragraphs that argue claims and contain topic sentences and evidence, all of it being wrapped up in a concluding paragraph. The primary difference is that the thesis statement will refer to two texts instead of just one, and some body paragraphs will discuss one text and some the other text, and some body paragraphs will discuss both texts. For instance, an essay on the time machine and the Communist Manifesto would have a thesis statement that refers to the time machine and the Communist Manifesto, and it might have a first body paragraph that discusses only the time machine, a second body paragraph that discusses only the Communist Manifesto, a third body paragraph that discusses both texts, and maybe a fourth paragraph that discusses only the time machine. The body paragraphs would by no means have to follow that specific order. That's just a possible example of an essay structure. In your essay, every body paragraph might make a claim about both texts. What's important is that there is at least one or two or a few body paragraphs that discuss both texts, so somewhere in the essay, clear connections can be drawn between them. So, how do you draw relationships between two very different texts? What do you look for? Let's discuss planning. We do know that H.G. Wells was very familiar with the work of Charles Darwin and very familiar with the work of Marx and Engels. But this isn't the kind of essay where I'm expecting you to go out and perform biographical research on Wells in order to prove that he actually, for certain, read The Descent of Man and the Communist Manifesto. In this essay, you're only working with the time machine and either the text by Darwin or the text by Marx and Engels. And what you're looking for in the two texts that you look at are places where their ideas seem to overlap or engage with each other or build on each other or differ from each other on a significant point. So as you begin to plan this essay, you want to think about what points or topics or ideas do both texts say something about, and what does each text say about that point or idea or topic? For instance, if you're writing about the time machine and Marx and Engels, you might think about how did the two texts portray the conflict between the social classes? Or how did the two texts portray that conflict developing over time? Or how do they portray the upper class, the working class? How do the two texts portray the possibility of a revolution? Are the two texts similar in their portrayals of these things? Do they differ in their portrayals? How? Why? Or if you're writing about the time machine and Darwin, you might think about what do the two texts propose are the reasons for change in the human species? Or how do the two texts portray the human species changing over time? Or what do they propose are the dangers of human evolution? How do they portray the struggle for existence? And finally, are the two texts similar in their portrayals of and proposals about these things? Do they differ in their portrayals or proposals? Again, how and why? You might also want to ask whether you're writing about the time machine and Darwin or the time machine and Marx and Engels. Does one text strike you as more optimistic than the other? Does one text seem to consider something important that the other does not? Do the two texts seem to agree up to a point and then diverge in their views? Where? Why? Do Marx and Engels or Darwin appear to have shaped or limited how H.G. Wells thought about the future? Does Wells appear to have misunderstood any aspects of Marx and Engels or Darwin, or to have adapted or innovated on any aspect of Marx and Engels or Darwin? You don't have to consider all of these questions. You don't have to consider any of them. You can come up with your own. Once you've thought about how the two texts you've chosen to work with overlap with or differ from each other on certain points, though, you'll want to come up with a thesis statement. What you want to avoid in coming up with a thesis statement for this kind of essay, though, is simply listing all of the ways the two texts are different from each other, or simply listing all of the ways the two texts are similar. For this kind of essay, the thesis statement should consider how the two texts overlap with each other, or differ from each other, or complement each other, or diverge from each other on a significant issue. So, for instance, you might write a thesis statement that makes an argument about how the Time Machine and the Communist Manifesto portray the working class, or the relations between the upper class and the working class, or the potential for revolution. Or if you're writing an essay about the Time Machine and the Descent of Man, you might write a thesis statement that makes an argument about how the Time Machine and the Descent of Man portray the struggle for existence, or the factors influencing the evolution of the human species, or the place of the human species in nature. Those are not the only significant issues that you can write about between those texts. The point is that this kind of essay is interesting not if it simply tells us how two texts are similar or different, but if it tells us how two texts overlap with, or differ from, or complement, or diverge from each other on a significant issue. So an essay on the Time Machine and the Communist Manifesto exploring the significant issue of working class revolution might have a thesis statement something like, I don't know, the Time Machine follows Marx and Engels' theory in its portrayal of the historical development of the working class up to a point. Whereas Marx and Engels predict the working class will eventually abolish all class distinctions, Wells foresees the essential class division remaining in place, with the two classes only reversing roles. That's just an example. The key thing is that your essay focuses on how these two different texts relate to each other on a significant issue. In this case, the potential for revolution of the working class. Working out the thesis statement is probably the trickiest part of this essay, since you want to identify an interesting way the two texts overlap or differ from each other on a significant issue. But once you move on to the body paragraphs, the essay gets much easier, I think. If you're arguing, for instance, that thesis statement, the Time Machine follows Marx and Engels' theory in its portrayal of the historical development of the working class up to a point, whereas Marx and Engels predict the working class will eventually abolish all class distinctions, Wells foresees the essential class division remaining in place, with the two classes only reversing roles. Then you develop the claims as you need them to support that thesis. You might, for instance, write a claim analyzing the portrayal of the working class in the Time Machine, write another claim in another body paragraph analyzing the portrayal of the working class in the Communist Manifesto, then write a claim noting the similarities between the Time Machine and the Communist Manifesto in their portrayals of the development of the working class, and then write a final claim arguing that the Time Machine diverges from the Communist Manifesto in its portrayal of the possibility of a working class revolution. In Wells, the working class does not abolish the class system, but switches roles with the upper class. And then, finally, a conclusion. That's a possible model. If you want to argue that the Time Machine basically agrees with Marx and Engels, which it's possible to argue as well, you might write several paragraphs in each of which you make a claim that identifies a similarity between both texts. That's another way to do it. And again, as for this paper, you don't have to do any outside research, but refer only to the Time Machine and Darwin, or only to the Time Machine and Marx and Engels. All the evidence for these claims will be quotes from those texts and analyses of those quotes. One last important note. In this essay, as in the previous essay, you are to assume your audience has read the literary text. Assume your audience has read the Time Machine. There's no reason to summarize the plot of the Time Machine. However, do not assume your audience has read The Descent of Man or the Communist Manifesto. Whenever you refer to an idea from one of those texts in this essay, you'll have to explain the idea by summarizing it in your own words and adding a few helpful quotations, and then explain how that idea relates to the Time Machine. Because this essay is on 2 texts, it's a little longer than the previous essay. It's 4 to 5 pages. But I think it will be interesting to write. Darwin and Marx definitely influenced H.G. Wells, but Wells did not necessarily follow all of their ideas exactly as he wrote The Time Machine. Darwin and Marx probably inspired certain of Wells' ideas, but Wells also did his own thinking about evolution and politics. He might have further developed some of Darwin and Marx's ideas, or deduced new ideas from their theories, or modified their ideas, or disagreed with them about certain things. We don't know exactly how Darwin and Marx influenced Wells. We can't get inside Wells' head. But in considering how Darwin and Marx might have influenced Wells' novel, and how Wells' novel might have responded to Darwin and Marx, we're also looking at how the theories and ideologies that surround people might influence how they think about the future.